So let me start by introducing at least the three panelists that we have with us today. Gabriela Gricius is a PhD candidate at Colorado State University's Political Science Department and a research fellow with NAADSN. Her research interests broadly cover international relations and environmental politics, with a focus on Arctic security, ontological security studies, the centrality of narratives in foreign policy, and exploring the roles of experts in national policymaking processes. Jackson Walling is a graduate research fellow at NAADSN. He graduated from Laurentian University in 2020, earned his honors Bachelor of Arts specializing in political science. Recently, he finished his Master's of Social Science, studying international relations at the University of Glasgow, and will be pursuing his PhD in Canadian Studies at Trent University. His MA dissertation focuses on the public opinion surrounding Canadian Arctic security, foreign defense orientations regular people emulate when it pertains to Canadian Arctic security, and ultimately how people shape their foreign policy beliefs. Jackson's research interests include Canadian Arctic security, foreign policy, defense, public opinion, and survey research. Renato Ficori is a PhD student in global studies at the University of Massachusetts in Lowell, Massachusetts, where he acts as an instructor of record and research assistant for the Department of Political Science. Renato's research focuses on Arctic security, the intersections between identity and narratives, securitization theory, and ontological security studies. He's been awarded the Bradford Morris Award in International Relations twice by the Department of State at UMass Lowell, and his work was recently recognized as Best Paper in International Security in 2018 at the third Research Symposium in International Relations hosted by UNESP Brazil for his article on the militarization of the South China Sea. I will remind our speakers that they have 10 to 15 minutes. I'll give you a quick note at the 14 minute mark, and then use my Zoom privileges to cut you off at around 17 minutes. And of course, hopefully Nana will join us and I'll introduce her afterwards. The order I have here is Gabriela, Jackson, and Renato. And unless there are objections, we'll proceed on that basis. So Gabriela, would you like to start us off?
Yes, let me just get my screen shared. 1 second.
Well, while Gabriela gets her screen prepped, we have some good news. Thank you, Nicole. Nana has just arrived, so let me introduce Nana as well while we're prepping for Gabriela. Nana, welcome. Nana Noor is from Denmark and has a bachelor's degree in Russian studies from Aarhus University and a master's degree in Russian studies from UIT, the Arctic Institute in Norway. She specializes in Russia's Arctic policy with a focus on the development of the Russian Arctic strategy starting from 2008. And so why don't we go in the order of Gabriela, Jackson, Renato, and Nana. All right, Gabriela, sorry for the interjection. I'll leave it over to you.
No problem. Can everyone see my screen? It's not in presenter mode. It's just the, okay, perfect. Yes. So thanks for the introduction. I'm really excited to talk to you about some research that was recently published in a policy primer with NAADSN. And so I'll be talking about the nexus of China Arctic expertise. But before I jump into the presentation, I just wanted to acknowledge the really important work of Nicholas Glesby, Rutan Gao, and Whitney Lockenbauer in helping us bring this research together. Super influential and needed. So to start the presentation, I wanted to start with this meme because it is true that experts seem to be everywhere these days. So whether you're listening to a radio host interviewing an expert on climate change, a TV presenter interviewing an Arctic security experts about dynamics in the region, how we're thinking about experts and expertise is clearly really important to how modern society operates. But it begs important questions about who is an expert? Is anyone who speaks on a topic publicly an expert? And how do we really measure expertise? Should we do that through publications, reputation? Lots of open questions here. And political science and broadly a lot of social sciences are reckoning with these questions But for the purposes of this presentation and this research, I was interested in understanding what does the corpus of expertise looks like when it comes to the China Arctic nexus. Are there certain individuals that tend to produce more knowledge than others? If so, who are they? And do they talk about China's role in the Arctic in a particular way? So that led us to our research question, which was from 2006 to 2021. What was being written on this nexus, this idea of China and the Arctic within social sciences? And our goal here was to kind of look through publications, what had been written in gray literature and academic databases, primarily in English. So we looked at a variety of databases such as Web of Science, JSTOR, ProQuest, Google Scholar, as well as we used this report called the Global Go-To Think Tank Index Report with Princeton University that lists the top 100 national and international think tanks, going through all of them, as well as Arctic think tanks and additional gray literature to see if any of the keywords, which are listed on the right side of your screen, came up. Obviously, a huge limitation of this research is that it was only in English and it didn't have to do with the reputations of the people. Rather, we were just interested in what is the amount of content that people have produced. And so to answer this question, and based on this data set that we gathered, which includes 708 publications and 803 authors, we were interested in who are the top producers of this work and how are they coding China and the Arctic within it. So that led us to the kind of first phase of this, which is we looked at the top 55 producers of content because these people produced more than 5 publications across this time period that turned up in the database. And so this only makes up 6.85% of the 803 individuals, which is a pretty shockingly small number. And that's why we thought these individuals were really noteworthy of study. And so we gathered information based on nationality, Western or Chinese affiliation, their educational information, employments, as well as any other additional affiliations, such as editorship of particular journals, or maybe they were a visiting scholar at some institution. And the goal of this was ultimately conduct a social network analysis. In tandem with that, we also conducted coding of what these producers produced. So this was 340 publications in total, and we coded it from 2 different approaches. So the first was based on an understanding of China and the Arctic, what sort of themes would come up. So we came up with themes initially such as conflict or cooperation dichotomy. Do authors focus on hard or soft security? Are they emphasizing issues that we know are important in Arctic circles, such as economic development, climate change, China-Russia relations, China-US. And in the process of coding, we also inductively came up with additional codes as well. So things that we did not expect to come up as much, such as economic development, let's say, or our particular case studies, Iceland, Greenland, or Chinese energy politics. We also looked specifically at whether there was a theoretical framework and the type of analysis, whether it was state or sub-state. And just a note, I'm definitely not going to go through all of these in this presentation. I'm just going to highlight the most interesting initial findings. But turning back to the experts or producers that produced this knowledge, the first finding that I alluded to earlier that was most interesting is that most pieces were written by a really small set of people. Or rather, there was a very small set of people that produced a large amount of publications, but most of it was written by individuals that only had one. So 66.87% of this data set only had one citation that we came across. And most of this had to do with reacting to topical news, such as, for example, in 2018, the publication of China's Arctic White Paper, or in 2013, when China joined the Arctic Council as an observer state. Pretty a significant number also only wrote 2 to 3 articles, so that's another 20%. And what this meant to us as researchers was that this epistemic community, this grouping of people that's producing knowledge on the China-Arctic nexus is really relatively small. And so then what if we turn to this actual distribution of people that were producing a really small set of knowledge, what does that network actually look like? And what we found is that the networks is really quite dense. In other words, many individuals of this top 55 were really closely connected with one another, and they were linked to institutions over and over again. And I've listed the top 6 institutions here. Funnily enough, NAADSN, rated as one of the top ones, We also had the Arctic Yearbook, which is perhaps unsurprising given that they've had a couple of China kind of subparts of their issues, as well as Nordic universities, so the University of Tromsø, Lapland, and Oslo, and Harvard University. An interesting finding here as well is that most of the Chinese nationals in our data set really stood out as being on the periphery. So there were a couple of exceptions, such as Li Qing and Jian Yang, but for the most part, when we found Chinese nationals that published a lot on the Arctic, they weren't affiliated with this really close-knit network of institutions. So to give you an idea of what this network looks like, you can see it here on your screen. Apologies for the quality. It's really difficult to get a high quality image here, but you can see just how really consolidated the network is at its core. And I'll zoom in a second so you can see what that internal center looks like. But you can see that kind of leaning outwards, that there are these trails that go out where particular individuals and institutions are linked to one another, almost in a eternal loop where they go back and forth. But what we found most interesting was right at the center of it. So you can see here, when the letters are larger, it means that they have more links. So the ones that I mentioned obviously have the largest texts. But if you look behind the text and you see all the lines going through, you can really notice just really how many people would study one place. They would be affiliated with one place. It was really a very tight network, which we found really interesting. And one of the things I'll end the presentation with today is just noting how we need to do a lot more future research on breaking apart some of these nuances and seeing, were people at the same place at the same time? How was that knowledge about China's role in the Arctic changing together or apart? But turning to what people were actually writing about, what I want to start by saying is that out of the 340 documents, it was really only 306 that had people in an editor or an author role. And so there were a decent amount of publications where individuals were only editors rather than authors. And given that we were coding based on content, we didn't think it was really fair to loop this group of publications into our data set. This meant that some people who originally had many citations ended up not being included. So two individuals in particular, editors of the Arctic Yearbook, actually ended up having no citations that we ended up coding here because they only were affiliated with this China Arctic nexus when it came to their editorship. But turning to what was actually in the content of these publications, the first thing that we found was this real dominance of a cooperation narrative in the Arctic rather than conflict. And in other words, what that meant is that when we were coding for a conflict versus cooperation code, we looked for how the author framed the Arctic in general. Did they talk about it through a framework of great power competition and sort of really drawing on this idea of potential conflict? Or did they focus more on the Arctic through a states need to work together, multilateralism is really important here? And what we found is that only 5 individuals used a conflict framing in more than 20% of their publications. And actually, by contrast, 31 took a more cooperative approach, which is just a really interesting finding, given that when we think today about how China is framed in the news, it is often done so through a conflictual lens. But when we're asking why would cooperation be so central, what might answer that question is that issues that came up most often in these documents were economic issues. So things such as economic development, broadly speaking, shipping, the Polar Silk Road, the China-Russia relationship, but specifically the economic aspects of this, as well as climate change, energy politics. But what we see here is that the topical issues that came up tend to be ones that emphasize cooperation. This does not mean that security was also not an issue that came up many times in these documents. So out of the 55, 30 authors reference or discuss security in some way. 18 use or discuss hard security in some realistic portion of their article, whereas 9 reference soft security. But probably what I found really interesting and what I think deserves much more research going forward is that where there was a really limited anti-China sentiment. And when we mean anti-China, we mean that the pieces came forth in a way that urged concern about China's role in the Arctic, or they said we should be a little cautious about including China in Arctic governance structures or working with China, versus a more pro-China approach was focused on the benefits of working with China and the benefits of bringing China into discussions on the Arctic. And so given that, there was a really limited amount of anti-Chinese sentiment in these publications. 25 out of the 55 leaned pro-China, and the majority did not express a sentiment either way, which could be due to the fact that many of these are academic articles. And so the opinion making is a little bit more limited than it might be otherwise in an op-ed in a national newspaper. So where does that leave us now? Turning back to that last slide, I think one of the really interesting ways we want to move forward with this research is asking, why is there this limitation in anti-Chinese pieces? There's a lot of different reasons why that could be. It could be self-censorship on the part of the authors. It could also be the general zeitgeist of the era, broadly speaking, or it could be due to a sort of domino effect from Chinese wolf warrior diplomacy that was directed primarily towards states. Answering these questions is obviously not something we can do just by looking at publications, and it would involve a more detailed interview process, but definitely a question we want to answer. The second is, we're curious how this network of China Arctic expertise operates in other languages. So specifically in Russian would be a really interesting case to understand that as the China-Russian relationship has grown closer in the Arctic, would we see in Russian publications kind of this also similar increase in positivity towards China there? Unclear, but just an interesting future question. And then, well, two additional things. The third that I did not list here is that we're interested in understanding how this network operates not only in publications, but from a conference perspective as well. So how does this community operate when it comes to panels? Do they often share the same panels at conferences like Arctic Circle Assembly or Arctic Frontiers? Are they applying for the same grants together? Are they, doing activities together that would suggest to us that this network is more than just we happen to publish on the same topic over time? And then lastly, the question, of course, that we all ask when it comes to the Arctic is, how has this changed since February 2022? Given China's lack of stance on the Ukraine war, we have seen kind of a shift in how Arctic states are behaving towards China. So would we also see that reflected in publications over time? But really excited to hear your questions and comments, and thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you so much, Gabriella. Jackson, I'd like to invite you to come up next, give you a second to pop up your slides if you have any. I'll remind everyone else that we will hold questions until the end.
Just okay.
Perfect. Looks good from my end.
Let me just get this out of the way. Can everyone hear me?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, perfect. All right, everyone. So thanks for the introduction. For the University of Glasgow, for my master's dissertation, I did an exploratory study about foreign policy attitudes and the Canadian Arctic. No research itself has done this before. I applied, I'll just start off with what I found the most interesting out of the sort. So just going on with it, we did a foreign policy orientations and we used a chi-squared multiple regression model to show how people associate and frame their foreign policy orientation specifically on the Arctic. We had 447 people over the span of 2 phases complete the survey. If I harassed you over email or Twitter, I'm sorry, but surveys are hard. So moving forward, we all know that the Canadian Arctic is in an area right now where a lot of our allies don't believe we have the capability to protect ourselves, essentially. And with climate change happening more drastically, we can see that more countries are starting to explore the area, and that leaves us in a vulnerable position. So one question I think a lot of us don't ask ourselves is, kind of as Gabriella was saying, everyone's an expert, but we don't consider what regular people think. And I think that's kind of a misstep, not only just for democracy, but also in the sense of they're the taxpayer. So moving forward, during the history of it all, the man in the glasses, Gabriel Allman, he kind of assumed that people knew nothing and they would put the country's best interests last. This idea that experts know more than regular people. And that was after World War II. However, after the Vietnam War, studies with survey data started to contradict all of these ideas that people are emotional, sporadic. They don't have any idea about international affairs or what it means. People know domestic policy more than they know actual international affairs. However, after the Vietnam War, it showed that people are principled, they understand what's happening in international affairs, and they do have opinions on how their government should act with respect to international affairs. So the question I asked is, let me just move this out of the way. So a question that no one has asked or nor investigated is, what is the Canadians' populace's perspective on Arctic security, and are they linked to their foreign policy attitudes? So the foreign policy orientations from the starting are isolationists and internationalists, and this started with Gabriel Allman moving forward in the late 60s. It's the exact same essentially as the liberal conservative continuum. Either people want to just stay within their own country and they don't want anything to do with international affairs, or they want to be an internationalist. However, moving forward, Eugene Witkoff discovered that there's two faces of internationalism: militant internationalism and cooperative, as well as a newly emerging phenomenon that my postgraduate supervisor, Thomas Scotto, discovered through his research, which I believe are on the next page. Yes. So militant internationalism is this idea of being hawkish. We do what we want. We're antagonistic. We essentially just go into a country, we do what we want. We are cooperative, but it's either our way or the highway. And then there's cooperative internationalism, this idea of diplomacy, cooperating with others. Everyone gets mutual gains by working together. And then global justice is humanitarianism, equality. Everyone cares for one another and everyone is equal. A good example of that would be disaster aid in other countries, for instance. But then the question I asked is, and a lot of people asked, are why are foreign policy attitudes important for regular people? Well, number one, democracy. Number two, not a lot of people think about it, I believe, but regular people put limitations on policymakers on what they believe is acceptable when it comes to international affairs and ultimately how they want their government to act on the world stage. So how are these attitudes organized? So it starts with an abstract value, and then it moves into a general posture. And then this is kind of where we tie into the Arctic, is a specific issue. So in our case, it would be Canadian Arctic security. What do Canadians think about Canadian Arctic security? Is it important to them? How do they want the government to act? What issues do they find important? There's a lot more research on this as well. If you're interested in public opinion survey research, I definitely can send you some links. And then our methodology. So we did a quantitative data collection in two phases. As I said, we did one before Christmas of 2021, and then in the new year of 2022 is when we did our hard launch. And then the basis of these questions that we put out, number one, for the foreign policy orientations, were based off of my supervisor, Thomas Scotto's 4-factor model approach. And then we also designed them through a quantitative and qualitative interview with the high-ranking military official, specifically General Brigadier William Radiff with Canadian NORAD out of Alaska. And our conversation with him allowed us to design these questions to basically get a better understanding of the military side of things, and then tie it together on what maybe a regular person can perceive. So this is our pie chart. We did this through scoring each number, scoring each question between 1 and 5, and then if they exceeded the limit, then they graded a score, for instance, would be CI. However, again, it's exploratory. So I have this pie chart, but then we also have a second pie chart that I didn't put into the presentation, but I can show if anyone's interested. And it shows where people tie into 2 orientations or more. But just for this presentation, we had a lot of cooperative internationalists, which kind of goes with the idea of, I believe, what it is to be Canadian. We want to be everyone's friend. We want to help where we can. Moving forward, so the results, so brace yourselves. So again, like I said, this was exploratory. We'll get into the conclusion of this, of what we're going forward, but some of the data I find is really, really interesting. There are some links between some people's foreign policy orientations and how they answer our questions, but we did not have a conclusive result. So we asked, do you think the Canadian military is capable of defending the geographical area highlighted in red? I think probably everyone's seen the photo of Canada, and then it shows the Arctic in red. The majority of Canadians did not believe that we have the capability, which I think is probably very well known. The one that I found really interesting is ISO. There were 6 people specifically that believe that we can. As well as global justices don't know, which tying into the orientation itself is really interesting just because it's all based on equality. So there's a lot of interpretations that you can have with all of the data, and I'd be really interested to hear what everyone else thinks. But to the next slide, should Canada spend more of its military budget on Arctic military defense? A lot of people were in favor in this, obviously. Militant internationalism was very expected in our hypothesis. We kind of assumed that a lot of people with militant internationalism, foreign policy orientation, were really probably concerned about the state of the Canadian military and how we're protecting the Arctic. The one that I thought was also very interesting, and again, this kind of goes between the styles of the two, is cooperative internationalism. I think that a lot of people with cooperative internationalism believe that NORAD, for instance, is just, I think a lot of people want, as it comes out, cooperation and working with one another to protect the Arctic. And then how do you think Canada should collaborate with other allied Arctic nations to provide military security in Arctic areas? So a lot of people obviously believe that Arctic nations and the USA, and I think we kind of see that now with NATO and possibly in the future. The one that I found probably the most interesting, and this is just my take on it, and again, I'd like to hear what everyone else has to say, is Arctic nations excluding the USA. People with global justice attitudes are not very much in favor on working with the USA. And I have a feeling that has to do with the polarization issues that happened there, as well as a past history of just, again, polarization. And then thinking about border or resource sharing disputes in the Arctic, what statement is closest to your point of view? This one was very split down the middle, to be honest with you, in comparison to all the others. So a lot of people either think we should defend it regardless of the costs or negotiate with other countries based on what we can. So I would assume that would just be the USA. However, the biggest, the biggest separation, I guess we could say, is with militant internationalism as well as cooperative internationalism. Unsurprisingly, cooperative internationalism want to negotiate with other countries, as well as militant internationalism just wants to defend its territory regardless of the cost and doesn't want to work with anyone. And then, do you feel that the threat of military conflict in the Arctic has increased? Obviously, a lot of people have said it has increased, and there was no link between the orientations of anyone for this question, but it was very evident that a lot of people has increased. Can't see that. Which country do you believe is the biggest threat to Canadian Arctic security? So this one I thought was really, really interesting just because it's all Russia. And I think that may tie into the fact that not a lot of people are aware of the steps forward China is making in the Arctic. whether that be scanning the bottom of the seafloor for possible submarine navigation. That was one of the conversations I had with General Brigadier Radiff. And there was no link again with the orientations using the chi-squared approach. Again, and then this was also no link with any orientations. But again, a lot of people believe that the Northwest Passage is within Canadian waters, which is obviously a very spirited conversation a lot of us have with people in the United States of America. And so kind of concluding, it's called exploratory for a reason. What we tried to do did not work, but we got really good data out of it. And moving forward, kind of buried myself a little bit in the sense that I did a chi-squared approach instead of a multiple regression model. Again, I'm sure Gabriella could tell you coding is very, very hard. I didn't really have the time to do it, but moving forward for my PhD, I'm thinking about incorporating this study into my doctoral dissertation, just as moving forward. Because again, I think a lot of people don't give a lot of regular people credit. I'm from Lindsay, Ontario, a small town and cottage country. The way I kind of designed this was talking to basically old men at the golf course. It's talking, what do they think? What are you reading? Like, what's going on? And not just older people, but middle-aged people. I think a lot of policymakers forget that people actually have opinions. People are knowledgeable. I don't think we give them a lot of credit where credit's due. So moving forward, we didn't get what we wanted, but we have a blueprint for going forward of what we can and cannot do. And I think a multiple regression model will certainly display better fits for the links between people's foreign policy orientations and what they think on the Arctic. I believe one of the other issues we had is the grading model we put in. It's another thing to change, as well as some of the questions. I think we need to get more specific on certain issues, and that will be a very good telling sign of whether or not people care about the Arctic and are reading about the Arctic every day. So final thoughts. Again, I think this is a realm of study that a lot of us need to look for. Public opinion, regular people do care. Again, like they're the taxpayer, they're the ones who are ultimately helping us fund and protecting the Arctic. And I think that moving forward, public opinion is definitely somewhere we need to look for. And I hope when I do this study again, or I move forward with it, that I can give you a bit better data on the links between foreign policy orientations, as there's only a little bit. But again, thank you for your time.
Well, thanks so much, Jackson. Renato, I have you up next. If you're ready to go, please share any deck you've got, and I'll turn the floor over to you.
Alrighty. Can y'all see my screen and hear me okay?
Yes, that's good.
Awesome. So hi, everybody. My presentation is entitled Interdependent Independence, Greenland-Denmark Relations and its Representations in Arctic Council Ministerial Meetings. And the order that I'm going to follow in this presentation is, first, I'm going to talk about the motivation leading up to it, some background on Greenland and Denmark, the methods that I use for this specific project, and then some discussion and some preliminary conclusions. So my motivation for this is Greenland, or Kalaalleq Nunaat, is currently on a legally established path towards independence from the Kingdom of Denmark. And although there is a lot of rising literature on all the economic and legal dimensions of this process, I did not know much about it. So this was a very selfish project that was led up by curiosity. And because both Gabriella and Jackson were talking about expertise, I'm not an expert on Greenland or Denmark, but I wanted to know more about it. So I wanted to know a little bit more about how the relations between Greenland and Denmark were portrayed narratively and their associations with identity. And the setting that I found for that project to conclude were Arctic Council ministerial meetings. And the findings from this exploratory work resulted in a paper that is forthcoming on the inaugural issue of the Journal of Arctic and Climate Security Studies. And we've been waiting on that for a while. So hopefully in the next 2 weeks, that inaugural issue is coming up. So some background, Greenland is a self-governing territory, which is currently a part of the Kingdom of Denmark, and it has been procuring more autonomy for the past 70 years. Some keystone moments here are in 1953, for example, when Greenlandic representatives started to participate in the Danish parliament. In 1979, it achieved home rule. In 1985, it became the first country to leave what would eventually become the European Union. And in 2009, Greenland was granted self-government because of the Self-Government Act that was passed by the Danish parliament. And very new to this process was that in June last month, Greenland released a draft of what can become its constitution. However, and despite this whole independence process, both countries are extremely interdependent. All of Greenland's earlier economic and political institutions are shaped after Danish models, and to this day, Greenlandic economy is very heavily subsidized and dependent on Denmark. Besides that, Greenland's imports are larger than its exports, which causes the country a significant trade deficit. And many Danish workers to this day occupy high positions in Greenland's public administration and also business sectors. And talking about Danish interdependence now, all or most of Danish Arctic identity and access to Arctic forests, such as the Arctic Council, is tied to Greenland and the Faroe Islands. So all of Danish Arctic legitimacy rests on Greenland and the Faroe Islands. Some of the methods that I used then for this project, I did a discourse analysis of Danish speeches from Arctic Council ministerial meetings from 1998 to 2021. And I also looked at the declarations that were resulting from those meetings. And although they were very sparse, I also looked at Greenlandic speeches when they were available. And in those speeches, I was particularly looking at audiences. So who are they talking to? Some trends in the speeches, and also the role of language in all of this. So talking about audiences, both Greenland and Denmark have domestic and international audiences to satisfy here. In the case of Greenland, because it is a culture nation, which is a term that was developed by Mark Jacobsen, where both the indigenous culture, identity, and marginalization are a great part of national identity. Greenland has been raising similarities with other minorities, such as indigenous peoples in Canada, and also the population of Alaska. And Denmark especially has to pay a big attention to its international audience, and it's been advocating for Greenland's contributions in the Arctic Council. And also because they're also talking to investors, there is a great focus on Danish speeches on infrastructural developments. And independence in those speeches have been portrayed very irregularly. In fact, the word only appeared once in more than 20 documents. And Greenland and Denmark, however, especially more recently, have been depicted as separate in some of the Danish speeches. So instead of saying the Kingdom of Denmark will do this, now they're saying Denmark and Greenland will proceed to do this. And interventions from Greenland have been focusing on promoting dialogue with other underrepresented groups. So there is a very clear us versus them narrative here that reiterates rights to self-determination. And also at all times, it feels like Greenland is trying to justify its position in the Arctic Council. And as I said before, Denmark has this focus on enhancing connectivities within Arctic states and Greenland through infrastructural projects. Another aspect that I looked at here is the role of language. And this is because Arctic Council officials are delivering speeches that are in English, and those are not the native, and English is not the native language of most people that are delivering speeches in the Arctic Council. And lexically, sentence structure in English will favor the use of passive voice. And although it is more formal, English's passive voice lexically tends to sound more pacifying. So I believe that using and archiving speeches in untranslated version, which is very common for Russian speeches in the Arctic Council, could also be a practice in favor of understanding some contextual clues that are given by language and that have not been very apparent in the specific speeches that I analyzed. Some early preliminary conclusions here are that independence is portrayed very irregularly. Greenland participation is very representative of its position as a culture nation, especially in its defense of marginalized populations. There is a very clear differentiation between an us versus them in Greenlandic narratives. And Greenland and Denmark are still very connected and dependent on each other. For Greenland, that is through commerce, labor, monetary policies, and Denmark. And for Denmark, Greenland is very important due to its access to the Arctic. So thank you so much. Let me stop sharing.
Oh, thank you very much. And thanks to all of our speakers so far for staying right on, if not under time, which is fantastic. Our last speaker today is Nana Noor from Denmark. Nana, if you have your slides ready to go, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Yeah. Can you see it?
Yes, looks good to me.
Yeah, okay. Unfortunately, I cannot put it on full screen. I don't know why. So this just has to do. Thank you for having me and thank you for the presentation. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the effects of the Ukraine war on Russia's Arctic strategy. My research question for my master thesis was how the current war in Ukraine has affected Russia's activities and its Arctic territory, and to what extent the effects of the war has caused Russia to deviate from its Arctic activities, policies, and strategy. In my analysis, I focused on natural resources, transport infrastructure, military security, and the international Arctic cooperation. Since this is some of the most important areas within the Arctic strategy, and these are also some of the most amenable to the international situation and changes. I compared the policy within these areas as they are formulated in the official strategies from 2008 up until now to statements and activities posted on Russian official websites, such as the president, administration, and so on, in the period from the beginning of the invasion to the end of September 2022. Yeah. What I found out is that right from the beginning, the goal of Russia regarding the natural resources was to make this the Arctic into a leading strategic resource base, and this has been the goal right from 2008, but also from 2008 and so on. Actually, this is quite an underdeveloped area. Still needs and did back then as well the infrastructure, the technology, and also regulation on this area. And to develop this, Russia has depended quite heavily on foreign investments, technology, and knowledge, and maybe also because of that, for large part, this has limited the progress from 2008 and up until now, and especially after the annexation of Crimea, the Russian annexation in 2014. The sanctions put on Russia afterwards especially hit the natural resources, and there were sanctions on imported technology and equipment, and many international energy companies withdraw themselves from Russian energy projects. The consequences of the Ukraine war has been an even more urgent need for new partners and investments due to new sanctions. This has also caused a lack of foreign equipment and technology, and of course a lack of buyers due to the closed European markets. In order to counter this, Moscow has tried to promote new private, domestic and foreign investments within energy and natural resource area, and they have also sought to promote domestic development of equipment that has been hit by the sanctions. And of course they have had to look for new markets, and especially buyers in east and south of Russia. China and India has been some of the most important buyers here. Within transport infrastructure, the focus has been on making the focus has been especially on the Northern Sea route in the Arctic strategy, and making this a main national transport corridor as well as an international one. As with the natural resources, this area was very also quite underdeveloped in 2008, and there needed regulation, safe navigation, construction of icebreakers and Arctic seaports in order to reach this goal. And when looking at the strategies up until now, the NSR has continued to be of high priority, but the progress has been limited. Although there has been some progress within regulation and construction of some icebreakers and the development of some Arctic seaports along the NSR. After the outbreak of the war, once again, the sanctions put on Russia has increased cost and also caused delays in construction of Arctic ports. The construction of vessels and navigation technology, and this has again put pressure on the existing cargo transportation along the NSR. And Moscow has sought to counter this by search for new domestic suppliers of the sanctioned equipment. Also, once again, due to the more or less closed European and Western markets, they have now sort of try to speed up the development of transport routes towards Asia, and this includes the NSR as well. And in order to do this, they have increased the public investments within this area. Military security. When you look at the military security parts of the strategy, they are quite small compared to the other areas, and that's because much of the military security and the defense policy is a part of the defense ministry and a part of programs which are classified. So here I cannot give the full picture of how the development was supposed to be according to policies and strategies, and how the war has affected this development. But what I can say is that it looks like the implementation process has been a lot faster compared to the other two, for example, transport infrastructure. From 2008 to 2020, the goal was to create and maintain Arctic military forces, sort of bringing them up to date. And already from 2020, they sought to improve these Arctic military forces and their combat capabilities. So it seems like they actually reach their goals, more or less. Once again, the annexation of Crimea in 2014 definitely changed like the threat perception in Arctic, and Russia increasingly focused on the potential of conflict with the other Arctic states, and increasingly focused on protecting the Russian territory from the other states. After the Russian invasion of Ukraine, this has just continued. Russia felt increasingly threatened by the other Arctic states to a level above 2014, and especially with the prospect of Finland and Sweden joining NATO. In reaction to that, they have continued and possibly intensified. Again, it's a bit difficult to say, but they have increased in the combat capabilities and rearmament of the Arctic forces. A more direct, what can you say, expression of this changed situation is the Russian maritime doctrine from 2022 that stated that they sought to increase the control of foreign naval activity along the NSR, and also to strengthen the Northern Fleet that is located in the Arctic. So it definitely has had some consequences. The last area and focus is the International Arctic Cooperation, and this has all the way through, ever since 2008, continued to have a very high priority to in the Arctic strategy, and Russia has been has adhered to international cooperation based on international law and treaties. The focus has also been to establishing strong cooperation within intergovernmental Arctic organizations like the Arctic Council and so on. And here again, you see one of the most central tendencies, I think, in the Arctic strategy, and that's the involvement of international actors in the development of the Russian Arctic zone. That Russia simply cannot reach their goals without any international involvement. Also here, you can see that after 2014, the focus has shifted a bit, and now the focus was also on peaceful resolution of international conflict. This is the first time that conflict was mentioned in connection to international cooperation, and also the mentioning of extra-regional states. And this is especially pointed at the Asian countries, especially China and India, to sort of include them more in the Arctic projects instead of the Western companies that did exit from many projects after 2014. Yeah, the consequences of the Ukraine war has been the suspension of all activities involving Russia within the Arctic Council, as well as other Arctic intergovernmental organizations, thereby also the suspensions of activities under Russia's chairmanship of the Arctic Council. Despite that, Moscow has stated that they were ready to continue the implementation of the Russian Arctic Council chairmanship program, but then they choose only to concentrate on like domestic activities, and they have also increased activities in order to attract Asian partners to Russian Arctic projects. And actually, they have also done this within the framework of the Arctic Council chairmanship. So what I found is that the Arctic Council also worked as a quite strong, you can say, brand for Arctic activities, also in domestic policy for Russia. So overall, I found that Russia has, as far as possible, tried to continue its policy and activities according to the official Arctic strategy, despite the negative effects of the Ukraine war. And that some of the most general tendencies have been that the sanctions have hit hard in this area, and it has been more difficult to develop like the natural resources and also the transport infrastructure, and that Russia, even more than before, are seeking new partners in this development process, especially among Chinese and Indian partners. Yes, yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Nana. So we have somewhere between 15 and 30 minutes for questions.